Okay, so if I've been running a few times a week, I'm in okay shape, but not great shape. How do I try to take my running to the next level? How do I try to run farther or run faster? What are the best things to do to improve?
Okay, so for a lot of people, the best thing to do is sign up for a race. It doesn't mean that you're going to be ultra competitive, but it just gives you a goal and a timeline. If you're kind of anti-race for whatever reason, like, oh, there's no races near me, or I just don't like crowds, you know, you can just mentally tell yourself, okay, in 8 weeks, I'm going to do a 5K and I'm going to time myself. So you just do like a one person race. But it gives you a goal, and then you can tailor your training backwards from that goal. So if you know I have 7 weeks or 8 weeks or 10 weeks, whatever the time frame is, you work your way back from that to determine what your training would be. Then what you do is you're going to have a few times a week. So you're going to up your training because you're getting more serious now from, let's say, 2 to 3 times a week. No reason to jump the whole way to like 5 times a week right away. You're not training for a marathon at this point or anything, and you don't want to suddenly overwhelm yourself with too much training. If you have 5 days a week of time, do some cross training of some other type. Do some weightlifting or do some swimming, something that won't bang on your joints quite as hard, but will improve your overall fitness. But running, we're going to limit to 3 days a week right now, we'll say. With that, you're going to do one day on Sunday or Saturday, usually on the weekend because people have more time, typically, depending on your schedule. But one day we're going to run a further distance. We may not even measure the distance, we may just run for time. So if we say, okay, right now I'm doing 2 runs and they're both about 20 minutes long. We're going to run for a half hour on the weekend. The other 2 runs, one of them is going to be about the same as what you've been doing, and the other one we're going to do some interval training where we run fairly slow for a few minutes and then run faster, not necessarily a sprint, but a little faster than what's comfortable for us typically, for maybe 30 seconds to 2 minutes. And then we're going to go back to running a little bit slower than we would normally to recover for a few minutes, and do that back and forth so that your body gets used to running at a faster speed over time. The other type of workout you can do as opposed to that, especially if you have a track in your area, is you can run on the track where you run fast for 200 meters and then jog for 200 to 400 meters and do that back and forth for 20-30 minutes, or for 2 miles, just depending on what you prefer doing, whether it's time or distance. Especially for a beginner runner, and especially if you're doing some of your running on a treadmill, some of your running outside, some of your running early, late, if it's kind of sporadic as far as the conditions and the time of day, I think training for time is a little bit better than training for distance. If you have one day where the weather is running perfect, it's sunny, but not too sunny, it's dry, no rain, not 1,000% humidity outside, 60 degrees. Some runners actually like it colder. I'm in South Florida, 70 degrees for me. Then you might end up running a quarter mile or a half mile even further in 20 minutes than you do on a day where it's 97 degrees in the shade and the humidity is 95%. If you go out and try to run the same distance that day, then you in worst case scenario, you end up injuring yourself somehow. But that's unlikely, but you just will be frustrated that you're taking longer to run the distance or something, and the conditions are just harder. Your heart's working a lot harder to cool yourself down and perform the same amount of work because of the conditions. So that's something you have to take into consideration. So I think for most people that are training just for overall fitness and to enjoy doing it, time is a better marker than distances.
Is it helpful or harmful to run your fastest sometime, to run flat out?
I think sprints are good, and they can be very helpful as long as you're already in good enough shape to do them and you don't overdo them. It's a whole different training stimulus to run sprints versus running at a slow kind of jog. You have to make sure that your body's prepared for that much stress, but it actually can be more beneficial than the slow kind of jogging is as far as long-term progress.
How will I know if I'm ready to do that kind of thing?
Well, if you've already been running consistently and you can do a regular, couple mile run without any pain, without any big, problems, you're not, wheezing and out of breath just from jogging around the block, then you're okay to do some short sprinting, and I mean very short, like, across the parking lot, a small parking lot, not across Walmart's parking lot or something, and see how you feel, right? It's all gauged off feel. This is why the intervals where you're just going from a slow run to a faster run, but you're still not at 100%, are probably ideal to start with. If you do those and you don't have any problems, then you can do all-out sprints, but they probably should be, in the realm of 100 yards, maybe even shorter, 50 yards to start. One thing that I like people to do, it's difficult to do in South Florida because we don't have a bunch of these, but you can do hill sprints. The hill will naturally slow you down some, so you're not sprinting as fast, and the position of the hill at an angle actually puts you at lower risk of pulling a hamstring or hurting something else because you're mechanically at a position that doesn't put as much stress on, particularly the hamstring, which is where people typically get hurt. Running downhill, whether it's running slow or running fast, is a much more stress to the joints and has a higher potential of you hurting something.
Do I have to be pretty warmed up before I sprint?
Yes. And warm up is an interesting thing, especially with sprinting. A lot of people will go to the gym or, lay down at the track or something to warm up before they do their running, and they'll spend maybe 20-30 minutes stretching. Stretching a lot before sprinting is probably not ideal because you're basically teaching the muscle and preparing the muscle to relax, and then right after you're asking the muscle to contract as hard as it can. So if you're real tight, doing some general warm-up and mobility work where you're doing some active stretching like lunging in different positions and doing some kicking motions and even some light jogging and step overs and different exercises that in another video when we're out in the gym I'll demonstrate, make a whole lot more sense than just laying and stretching or rolling around on a foam roller for 20 minutes and then getting up and trying to sprint, because you've just told your body for the last 10, 15, 20 minutes, hey, we should relax now, and then you're asking it to work hard. It's better to do something that's a little more dynamic, that gets all your joints moving and gets your heart rate up some so that there's blood flowing to the muscle as your warm-up before you sprint. But yes, you want to do some warming up beforehand.
So if I do a sprint, how will I know I've overdone it? I mean, obviously if I pull something or hurt something, but is it how out of breath I am? Is it my recovery time? Is it how much my heart is pounding?
Well, obviously if you pull something, something's not right. So that's not good. The majority of that other stuff, it really, if you're out of breath, you're doing it right. If you feel like you might throw up, that's not necessarily the goal. If you have a hard time catching your breath, you're probably still doing it right. You'll need a certain amount of recovery time. If you feel like you're completely recovered and you can like hold a conversation like this and you're rested, then you probably waited too long. If you happen to be using a heart rate monitor when you're doing your training, like a lot of runners do, you want your heart rate to recover, but it doesn't necessarily have to come the whole way back to a resting level, because it should already be up a little because you're warmed up. Those numbers are very different for everybody, just depending on your training amount, your age. But theoretically, let's say your resting heart rate is 50. That's pretty low, but there are people that have resting heart rates that low. It just makes the numbers easier for me off the top of my head. And your activity at a fairly low level, like walking at a fast pace or maybe even jogging, your heart rate is 100. And your maximum heart rate, where you feel like your heart's going to come out of your chest somewhere, is 200. Which would be high for most people unless you're like in your teens or 20s. But let's just say it's there. When you're doing your sprints, your heart rate probably should be between 80 and 95% of that. So it should be like 180. When you recover, it doesn't need to come the whole way back down to 100, but it should be fairly close to that, maybe 120. And then you're ready to do another sprint. If you're doing your sprints and it takes a long time, what's a long time? If it takes 5-6 minutes for your heart rate to come the whole way back down to 120, you're probably pushing too hard. Or you've done enough sprints at this point. Like, let's say you've been doing 5 sprints and you decide, oh, today I'm doing 20 for some crazy reason. When you get to like 14 sprints and suddenly was taking a minute or two for your heart rate to come back down and now it's taking 5 minutes, you should stop. Your body's saying, hey, this is too much work for us to recover, and if you keep doing this, we're going to let you know by something bad happening. Well, whatever that is. Probably, pulling your Achilles tendon or something. Some spraining your ankle because your form is broken down so much, you're so tired that you run stupidly, or something's going to happen that's not good. Or you're going to do all 20, and then the next day you're going to feel like a truck ran over you. And then you're going to feel like that for like 4 days. And that's not so good for consistent training, which we've talked about before. So you definitely want to challenge yourself, but you can, push yourself too hard if you're overly enthusiastic with sprints when you first start them.
I wear a heart rate monitor and it doesn't always feel like it reflects how hard the exercise is for me. Sometimes I at least perceive that I'm working hard, but my heart rate's not that high. Am I still getting benefits?
Yes. Most likely. Heart rate monitors are tremendously better than they were 5-10 years ago. All these different wearable technologies are either new, or some of the stuff like the old school Polar heart rate monitor we've had for almost 20 years, and they work much better, but they don't always work that perfectly. So there are times where you might feel like my heart rate must be 160 right now, and you look and it says it's 110. Maybe it's not that low. It could be your heart rate monitor. And maybe, the contact's not so good. Maybe the battery's a little low. There's a lot of potential there. So, you can do it the old school method where you just put your fingers on your pulse here or on the side of your neck here and try to check it yourself and see like, oh yeah, it is that low. I just am out of breath. Or, oh, it's way faster than what this says. The other thing that can happen is if it's real quick is that the monitor may not pick up every beat. So you have to be aware of that. Occasionally, it won't pick up the beats because they're irregular, and then you have an arrhythmia, which is a concern, something that you want to see your doctor or cardiologist even about. There's a ton of people that have arrhythmias and exercise all the time. It's one of the recommended things to do if you have one. But if it's irregular, or if you have a severe arrhythmia, it can be, a medical emergency even that you need to get checked out. So that's not most people, but it is some people. The other thing is that there can be days where your heart rate is low, but your body's just tired, so it feels like you're working harder than you are. Or there can be the opposite. There can be days where you feel pretty good, but your heart rate is real high, and those are the days that the heart rate monitor is telling you this is enough work. Like, if you're in a training program where you're trying to get to, let's say, 70% of what your maximum heart rate is, which is a kind of a complicated thing, what your maximum heart rate is, but typically we use an equation of 220 minus your age to get a general number. Some people can be 5-10% different than that, but in general most people are somewhere near to that 220 minus your age number. And then if you're trying to work out at 70% of that, and your heart rate monitor says you're at 75% of that, and you feel like you're barely working, you don't want to push harder and suddenly be up at 85-90% like we were for sprinting, or else you're just going to be over fatigued for other workouts later in the week.
What do you think about cooling down or stretching after the workout? How important is that? Can I quit my workout and go straight to a meeting?
You can, but your body might not be the happiest with you. Honestly, with my workouts personally, I do it often, but I wouldn't recommend it because I typically sneak my workouts in between 14 or 16 hours of patients, either in the middle of the day or at the end of the day. And if I do it in the middle of the day, I have somebody coming, I usually cut the cool down very short or don't do it at all. And at the end of the day, I want to get home to actually eat something. So my cool down isn't as long as it should be, but you should do some stuff, especially if you know that you have some areas that are kind of nagging problems where your hamstrings are kind of tight or your shoulder gets a little angry sometimes. Your mobility and stretching work actually is better to do after working out because your body's already warmed up, and a warm muscle stretches a whole lot easier than a cold muscle. A cold muscle is like trying to stretch taffy after you put it in the refrigerator. Doesn't stretch so well. More breaks. Whereas a warm muscle is like stretching taffy that you just made, and it's nice and warm and stretches easy. Also, it just helps with recovery. It's something that, a general cool down, whether it's just walking around the block or doing, a couple stretches or doing some different things pretty similar to what you did at the beginning of your workout as your warm up, just helps the joints kind of recover and the muscles just feel better. So typically you can not necessarily prevent all muscle soreness, but you can prevent some muscle soreness, and a lot of times you can prevent some joint aches and pains by doing a little bit of cool down afterwards.
So I'm a heel striker when I run. How much do I need to worry about my running form? Do I need to try to change it? Do I need to run on my tiptoes the way I've seen?
The simple answer is no. No. If you're just sprinting, it's not a bad idea to work on running form and mechanics and landing more on your forefoot up near your toes. Not on your toes. We're not doing ballet, we're sprinting, but on the front of your foot. Where's my shoe? Hold on 1 minute. Running shoe. 99% of the world, when they run, they land on their heel like this. This is why we put all this padding back here on most shoes. It's why you have a fat pad on your heel, because the mechanics of both walking and running look like this. You land on your heel, you roll through the middle of your foot, your big toe over here becomes a rigid lever and pushes off, propelling you forward. Up here, you have mostly skin and bone and a couple little puny muscles. So if you land here, especially with my 240 pounds of weight, these bones aren't happy with you. I know, I've broken some of them. So don't land here unless you're very small and you're running for very short distances. If you watch even the Olympic mile race, well, we don't run the mile in the Olympics here. If you watch the 1600 meter or even the 3200 meter race at the Olympic level, even a handful of those racers are landing on their heel. The only people that land on their toes all the time are like the guys that finish first or second, and the people that are doing like the 100-meter dash. The longer distances that really aren't that long compared to road racing, like if you're going out and running 5Ks, 10Ks, definitely marathons, all of those people are landing on their heel, even at an elite level, because it's just mechanically not very efficient and a whole lot more pounding on your body to land up here all the time.
Now, I'm also thinking about running longer distances, but I'm worried about my joints and my knees, and I've heard that running marathons, for example, is bad for your cartilage, bad for your knees.
It can be, but it's not as bad as just being out of shape in general. There's a school of thought and a group of people, particularly in the weightlifting community, like the strength athletes, that think anything more than, maybe a mile is way too far, and that it beats up your joints. And then there's people in the running community that think any kind of strength training more than body weight is way too much and beats up your joints. Neither of those are really true. The body's designed to move. A large study in England years ago looked at joint replacements and people's activities, and their hypothesis was that runners, and particularly long distance runners, marathoners, would need more hip and knee replacements than the general population. What they found was the exact opposite, that long distance runners actually had less joint replacements. When they looked at the data a little closer, they found that runners typically have a lower body weight because they're running so much, especially long distance runners. So the increased wear and tear, which there definitely is, of doing thousands of foot strikes per week, more than the average person running, is still less wear and tear than just getting up and down from a chair, getting in and out of the car, getting off the toilet when you're 20, 30, 50 pounds overweight. That being said, there's a happy medium with anything. If you do a marathon a month for 10, 12, 20 years, or if you do ultra marathoning, which there is such a thing for those of you that don't know, people that run 26 miles and then say, oh, that was way too short. Craziness. But there are people that run races. I have a few friends that run 100-mile races. That is tough on the body, but the body's designed that it can take all kinds of wear and tear if you train properly. I think that when you get to distances above probably maybe even a 10K, definitely more than a half marathon, it's really specific to your body. There's some people that just, the way their body's put together and the way their anatomy is and their psychology and all kinds of other things, that if you told them we're going to go lift this 500-pound rock, they would be much better equipped at that than we're going to go run this 500-mile race. So some of it's training and some of it's just how you're put together physiologically as well.
Can you look at someone and tell if they're a potential runner?
Maybe. You can look at people and know that their body physically, just the way it's put together, that they're more likely to be a good runner. But an awful lot of it comes down to just training, and putting in enough training and enjoying it. You could have two people that are built exactly the same, and one could be a great runner and one could be an awful runner, just because the one doesn't enjoy doing it, or the other thing that's hard to see a lot of times from the outside is past history. If somebody looks normal to you and me, but they have had 3 knee surgeries, running for them might not be a good plan. Maybe they should pick up swimming because it's a lot less pounding. Then there's some people, for whatever reason, we really don't understand it completely yet, but we're gaining knowledge on it almost weekly anymore, is the genetic factor of things. There's some families that over the last decade or so, I've seen almost everybody in the family, from the grandparents down through the grandchildren, that all have joint issues, and their cartilage just isn't as sturdy. And when you start seeing whole family trees like that, you have to say, I don't think it's just, something they're doing or something they're eating. It's something with the tissue itself that's just not the same. So, if you're tall, have long legs, skinny, don't hold a lot of extra body fat, have big lung capacity, and your joints seem to be almost bulletproof, then you'd probably be a great runner. Oh, and have a fairly high pain tolerance, because at some point running long distances gets very uncomfortable. If you have all that stuff, then running is a good sport for you. If you're, shorter and very explosive and have, wide shoulders, then maybe something like weightlifting or even, shot put or something is a better choice, because you have that explosiveness to throw objects, but you don't have the ability to go out and run miles and miles, because you have to take a whole lot more steps if your legs are shorter. So it's actually more work for the same distance. So that's why, we don't do it too much in the United States, but in a lot of other parts of the world, it started with the Soviet bloc, and then China's done it more recently, and Australia even did it to a certain extent before the Sydney Olympics, is that they'll take measurements of children in school, and they'll select them for certain sports based off their body dynamic. You know, if your arms are real long and your lung capacity and your heart rate and all these things are, you're going to become a rower, and they just decide you're going to be a rower. If you're 12 years old and you wear a size 15 shoe already, so your feet look almost like flippers and you have long arms, you're going to become a swimmer. You don't have a choice of anything else. They send you to a school where you still do your studies, but you swim like 4 hours, 5 hours a day, every day. Here it's more what the kids like and what the parents kind of steer them towards, or you just happen to live in a part of the country like South Florida where you can play baseball every single day instead of just the 4 months that there isn't snow on the ground. So it's a little bit more random as far as how kids find sports here versus in some other parts of the world. But definitely, and especially Olympic style sports and other parts of the world, it's very much self-selected, or not self-selected, like state selected, where the government, or at least the different clubs in the area, look at children definitely by the age of 5 or 6, and a lot of times a little bit younger, and determine this is what you're going to do or not.
So if I'm trying to improve my running and I need some variety, I'm getting a little bored with running, but I want to keep it up to some degree, what other activities are most compatible with running or will help support or improve my running?
I think probably the closest one that's often overlooked that we've already talked about is walking. I know a few people that ran high level cross country, like Division I college cross country, or even, professional cross country afterwards. And all of them were told by their coaches that on their off days, which weren't that many, but when they had off days, they were supposed to do speed walking, because it still forced all the muscles to work in a fairly similar pattern, but it was a whole lot less wear and tear to the joints. It didn't have nearly as much pounding. I think cycling is good, but it's not nearly as similar as far as the movement pattern. Same thing with swimming. There are some runners that take up triathlon. Either they switch over to it completely because they find that it's less wear and tear to their body having 3 different sports to train for, or they do it just as a side thing so that they can do some other training and they don't get bored doing just one thing all the time. Rowing is a good option. If you're in the gym setting,